This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work, with another in our series, Wolff Responds. This time the issue is the housing crisis in the United States and how basically to understand it. Newspapers, radio, and television are full of pictures and stories, often really heart-wrenching, about the problems of housing in the United States. The millions, and I say that word having looked at the estimates, the millions of people who suffer homelessness at one time or another during a year, the typical last 5 or 10 years in America. I live in New York City, where the homeless are on display on many avenues and many streets across the city. Some are old, some are young, some are white, some are black. It is a tragedy you can see and feel for every day. In some of our cities, it's so tragic that we have really mass movements. San Francisco has seen a spike in rental rates, in the prices of homes, far beyond what most of the rest of the country is suffering. But the problem is everywhere. It doesn't just show up in homelessness. It also shows up in the number that we use in economics to assess how housing, in a sense, is going. We've done many calculations and discovered that roughly somewhere between 20 and 30% of income is a reasonable basis for the cost of housing. In other words, you can live a decent life in terms of all the different things you have to buy: food, clothing, education, medical care, transportation, etc. You can do that in a decent way if your rent, one of the most basic demands you have, does not absorb more than 20 to 30% of your income. For millions and millions of Americans, they have gone beyond that. Whether it's the home costs, the house itself, the maintenance of the house, the mortgage to pay for the house, or whether it's a rental, it is soaking up 40, 50, and more percent of people's incomes, making the rest of life very, very difficult. That's why it is perfectly reasonable to speak about a housing crisis. When we talk about rents, which have gone particularly rapidly up in recent years, we're talking about money being taken out of the family's income just for the place they live, leaving too little for all the other needs a growing family needs, and a not growing family as well. When we turn to look at homes that have been purchased, we see another kind of bizarre problem. The vast majority of Americans cannot afford to buy a home with the money they have. So the vast majority, and we're talking in the 90%, have to go and borrow money to buy a home, a condo, a co-op, a freestanding home, and so on. And when they borrow to do that, we call the name of that borrowing a mortgage. They take out a mortgage to buy a home. The problem here is that a mortgage then has to be repaid. It's a loan, and it's repaid over 5, 10, 15, 20, even 30 years. When you add the interest on that loan to the price of the home you buy, it actually means you're paying even more for your home, for your housing, than if you could afford it. That is, to buy it pretty much straight out. Here's the economic analysis, and it is very simple. A lot of people spend a lot of time working on details, but don't lose the forest for the trees. Here's the economic forest. Housing is a matter of paying the average American person enough money to afford housing without bankrupting all the rest of a family's needs. In other words, either you bring down the cost of housing, lower rents and or lower mortgage payments and or lower housing prices, or you raise the wages and salaries of people so that they can afford them. One basic test of the capitalist system we live in is, has it solved that problem? Does American capitalism, for example, give on the one hand enough wages and salaries, and on the other hand enough units of housing at affordable prices to allow the people who need housing to buy the housing without spending more than 20 to 30% of their income? And the answer in the United States is a resounding no. Capitalism has not done that for millions and millions of its people, and it hasn't done it in a long time, and it doesn't look like it's going to be doing it anytime soon. That's not a failure of the particular housing industry or the particular salaried worker here or there. It's a failure of the system not to have solved the obvious problem. Either bring down the cost and price of housing or raise the incomes of the people who need them. Otherwise, you will see this crisis worsen and the image of the homeless become a part of what defines the United States.